Hi everyone, and welcome to the next session at this year's Global Integration Bootcamp for 2021. This session's on the BizTalk Migrator, so Microsoft's BizTalk Migrator tooling. We'll be doing a deep dive. Dan Toomey earlier today, depending on what time zone you're in, did an introduction or a lightning session on the BizTalk Migrator. Today we'll go into a lot more detail on this session. So we've got a lot to cover. Right, my name is Dan Probert, and I'm the CTO of a company called Affinis Limited based in the UK. I've been working in integration most of my life. I've been working with BizTalk since 2002 and with Azure since 2008 and with Logic Apps since before they were called Logic Apps, somewhere in the sort of 2014-15 region. I've also been looking a lot into the problem space of migrating BizTalk to Azure since 2015, and I was involved in writing some early tooling looking at migration. You can reach me on Twitter at ProbertDaniel or LinkedIn, also at ProbertDaniel. Right, the agenda today. I'm going to give you a high-level overview of the tool. I'll talk about how we get the tool and run it or execute it, how it works. I'll take you through a demo of migrating an application, and then I'll show you what Azure artifacts the tool generates. Then we'll talk about, we'll do a demo of actually deploying the artifacts to Azure, and then a demo about what orchestration migration is supported and what it looks like up in Azure. And then we'll talk a bit about some of the advanced concepts. So that's a lot to get through in 40 minutes. So I will do my best to get it all done. Right, high-level overview. So the BizTalk Migrator is an open source command line tool developed by Microsoft. You can find the source code on GitHub at the link shown here. And Microsoft wants your feedback on the tool. They want to know what else do you want it to do. It's a starter for 10 if you like. It's got some great support in it, and it could do more. But if you follow the link here, aka.ms/BizTalk Migration Survey, Microsoft have a hosted survey where you can talk about what your migration needs are, if you have any, but also what support you'd like to see in the tool. And they'd really welcome any comments. The tool is plugin based, so it runs a series of plugins to parse and analyze and then convert a BizTalk application. And it takes in a BizTalk MSI, so the MSI that's exported from, say, the BizTalk console. It takes in one of those, and then it converts it to a series of BizTalk artifacts, so specifically scripts for deploying those BizTalk artifacts. Currently, the version of the tool that's out there at the moment, the preview version, supports file, FTP, and HTTP adapters. It supports built-in pipelines like the XML transmit and receive and pass through, transmit and receive. It also supports custom pipelines, for example, JSON encoder and decoder and the flat file decoder, and then simple orchestrations, plus transforms on maps and property schemas and things like that. What does the migration process look like? Well, there's 3 phases: assessment, conversion, validation. And each of those are broken down. There's 5 stages, and each of these stages is handled by a series of plugins. So there's some default plugins that come with the tool, and the idea is that the community can write their own plugins for specific scenarios. But the discover phase takes in the BizTalk MSI. The parse phase takes what the discover phase has found in the MSI and parses out the orchestrations and pipelines and schemas and maps, and then analyzes what's been parsed and builds a model of it all. And then there's a report stage here, which takes that analysis output and builds a report. And you can stop at that point if you want. The tool is quite useful if you want to just get a list of all your BizTalk applications and your BizTalk estate. But you can then continue on, and there's a convert stage which goes through and builds a series of artifacts to be deployed, and then there's a verify stage at the end. How do we get the tool? The tool is available via Chocolatey, which is a internet-based package manager. You have to install Chocolatey on your machine first, and you do that following the instructions here at chocolatey.org/install. Then when you've done that, you install it from a command prompt. You install the migrator and choco install BizTalk migrator and then -- pre, because it's still a pre-release version. And then running the tool is very simple. It's command line aim.exe, Azure integration migration.exe. And if you do -- help, you'll get a big long page full of all the options and some samples to run it. But what you're mainly going to be using is aim assess, which generates a report, or aim migrate, which does the actual conversion and generates a report. You pass in the path to the MSI, and there's options for passing in multiple MSIs if you've got dependencies, or a folder of MSIs if you want to do your whole estate. And you specify your primary region, which is used for the output templates, and also a unique deployment ID. I'll talk a little bit about that later and why that's important. There's additional options, -v for verbose logging. So if you hit an error and you want to see exactly what was going on, you can rerun with a -v. And also -- no abort. By default, if the tool hits a problem, it stops. But if that problem was something that you don't really care about, you want to keep running and generate all the scripts anyway, then just put that at the end of the command line. How does it work? Well, you start off with an MSI, and the MSI is extracted, and we end up with a binding file and some BizTalk DLLs, and that's the discover phase. Now, the DLLs could be BizTalk assemblies that contain orchestrations and schemas and maps and all the rest, or they could just be other assemblies that you're referencing in your application. And then from there, we start building a source model, and this is the parse phase or parse stage. So the source model describes what we've found in BizTalk. Then the tool will start building a target model. This is the analysis phase. So from what we've found, what could we deploy to Azure and what would that look like? And it takes a pattern-based approach here where it says, if I take the BizTalk artifacts, what's the equivalent to those in terms of an enterprise pattern? And then what does that enterprise pattern look like in Azure? Following that, we have the report phase where we output a report. And then we start generating the scripts and templates, and that's the conversion or convert phase, the final phase. And we end up with a lot of scripts and templates. Right, let's get into a demo. So what I'm going to start off with is going into Terminal, and I've already got Chocolatey installed, but I want to install the product. So as we showed earlier, I'm going to choco install BizTalk Migrator -- pre. It's going to go away, and it's going to go and find the packages, tell me I've got to accept the licenses, and then it's going to download those packages. Here they go. And download them, and there's a couple of them, and then at the end it's going to ask me to confirm I'm okay to run a script, and the script is just setting up some configuration for the tooling. And here we go, and it's almost done, and there we go. So yes, I want to run the script. Done. All right, the tool's installed. Brilliant. If I go aim -- help, I mentioned earlier, you'll get a lot of help suddenly pop up. There we go. Look at that. So there's all the command line options, and then there's some more information about the types of options, and then down here are some samples specific to BizTalk. So, you know, if I want to do more than one file, you can use a pipe symbol, or if I want to do all the files in a folder, you can do that as well. The next step is going to be actually migrating an MSI, but where do we get one from? I mean, you might have a BizTalk server with one on, but will it work? Well, the nice folks at Microsoft have some samples you can use. Here's the repo. So this is the source code. You can go in and have a look at all the source code. There's actually 5 repos. There's AIM tool, which is the main repo with all the documentation and everything, and there's frequently asked questions and information about the scenarios. There's a repo called AIM BizTalk, and that's where all the code that understands BizTalk is. And then there's AIM Azure, which is all the Azure templates used to build the scripts and everything and what we put into Azure. And then there's 2 more repos as well. Now I'm interested in the AIM BizTalk repo because in there is a folder called scenarios. And in there are all the scenarios. So for example, FTP pass-through, pick up a file through FTP, use the pass-through pipeline, drop it in the message box, pick it up on a send port, use the pass-through transmit pipeline, and drop it out to an FTP server. Simple. There's a BizTalk solution here that has the bindings and stuff in it, and then there's the MSI file. So this is the MSI file I want to try migrating. Now I can just download this from here, or I could go back up to the top level and I could use the code option here to download all the code. Or I could use git properly, and I could either fork and clone, or I could just clone this repo. And I chose to clone the repos. So I actually have them on my machine. And I've already copied out the MSI file I want, and it's sitting in a folder just back up here, sample MSIs, and it's aim FTP pass-through MSI. That's the one I want. So to do that, I have already typed out here what I need. So let's go back to terminal and put that in. So we're doing aim migrate, and then we're passing in an argument, which is the name of the file and primary region. And then we have this unique deployment ID I mentioned earlier. And the reason we need that is some of the artifacts that get deployed in Azure are globally unique. Well, they have a globally unique name. So for example, Azure API management or a storage account or app configuration, their names form part of a DNS entry. So you can't have more than one. So because of that, we need a way to make sure that if somebody else is running this tool and they happen to have a BizTalk application with the same name as you, then if there's no way of differentiating them, you'll both try and create, say, a storage account with the same name, and one of you is going to fail. So this lets you put a unique suffix on the end of every resource name so that you know it's yours. And it's kind of a way of defining a server group as well, because every other migration that you do that has the same deployment ID will go to the same deployment. And we'll talk about that later, that there are certain core resources that are common no matter how many applications you deploy. So we run this, and the tools start running, and we get lots of lovely output in the logger here. It's going to run all the plugins across it, and in a second it will be done. There we go. That's how long it took to effectively migrate a BizTalk application. Admittedly a simple one, but it's generated 312 template files. So that's a lot, and we'll talk about why there's so many in a bit. But if I come out here, I can see there's an aim 12820 folder, and that's where it's put everything. And I can come up and find that aim 12820, and in here is the report and some other folders. And in the report, if I open that up, it's made up of a number of files, but in here I can see information about my BizTalk applications. I've only got one of them because I only did one MSI, and then what it's going to put out the other side. And then also message bus and system application. So message bus is a core application that contains your app config and APIM and things like that. System application is akin to the BizTalk system application when you install BizTalk, and it's got pipeline components in there like JSON encoder and decoder and things like that. And then the actual application I'm trying to migrate. What's important to understand is that if I do 5 MSIs, I'll end up with 5 applications here, but only one system application and one message bus. That's why I say it's a bit like your BizTalk server group. And if I do a completely separate migration, I run it and deploy, and then in a week's time, I do another MSI separately, but it has the same unique deployment ID, and it's going to the same region, and I'm deploying to the same subscription. That will reuse the same message bus and system application, and will just add what's needed for the application. And if I can jump in here and I can start to see what's in here. Look, I've got a send port and it's using FTP, and here are the properties of it. And I can use up here, I can come down to the output application and look in here and see what's inside. So the report's actually quite useful on its own, even without doing a migration, just to document your BizTalk estate. Alrighty, so now I've done a migration and I've got a report and I've got some output files. Let's talk about what those output files actually are. What do we generate? I talked about a message bus, system application, and whatever application we have. In message bus, we've got like a config store and routing store, the app config to store configuration. Artifact store, it's the integration account. APIM is used mainly for caching, but also decoupling functions and the app config from the logic apps. Key vault and storage. There's a routing slip router. If you're not familiar with a routing slip, it's also known as an itinerary and says I'm going here and then here and then here. And it's what makes all this so powerful, because all the bits and pieces in here are wired up via config. So if I want to say my pipeline is now using a flat file encoder or decoder, I can just change configuration and it will start working. You can sort of do that in BizTalk, but not with as much flexibility as you can here. And then the system application has things we recognize from BizTalk, service bus, JSON encoder and decoder. Sorry, service bus is the message box, I should say. It's using topics to replicate the message box and subscriptions. But JSON encoder and decoder, flat file decoder, content promoting, taking using a property schema to take a value out of a message and promote it to context. Content demotion, how many of you have done this? Taken a value from context and demoted it into a message. XML processor, which handles promoting the message type and envelopes and stuff. You know, there's all the stuff here that's from BizTalk effectively. And then your application, and you'll generally have a receive port and send port. Topic subscriber, if you think about a send port, it subscribes to a message and then it runs through a pipeline or a map and then a pipeline and then actually sends it. So in this case here, they're split into two separate things because the topic subscriber subscribes to it and then it runs through a route, through the routing slip to say, well, where do I go next? And will eventually end up at the send port. Process manager, which is an orchestration. So the pattern for an orchestration is known as process manager, and then API connections. So let's do a demo of deploying to Azure. As mentioned earlier, what we end up with, sorry, I've jumped a little bit there. What we've ended up in a folder here is a whole of artifacts. So in the conversion folder here, we have a deploy all and a tear down all script, and they're PowerShell scripts. And then under applications, we've got, say, the system application. And if we go and look at intermediaries here, we have all those logic apps I talked about earlier, say the JSON decoder. And in there, we've got an ARM template for the logic app and a parameters file, and then a number of PowerShell scripts that either deploy or tear down that. And all that at the top level, all the deploy all does is run every single PowerShell script in order. But it does it using the Azure CLI, which means that it assumes you've already installed the Azure CLI and you've logged in and you've selected the correct subscription. And I know people that haven't done this and it hasn't worked. And you end up with what's called the wall of red where something fails earlier on. So if we talk about the Azure CLI just for a second, if you haven't used it, I've installed it here, but we'd go AZ login to log in, and it pops up a browser window and asks us to select our account in a second. There it is. And then I have to go back here and it will give me all the subscriptions I have access to as JSON. It's, not entirely user-friendly. And then I can use Azure account set -s and give it a subscription ID to set the default one. You have to do all this before you run the PowerShell file, and so it's not particularly intuitive. We were doing some work with the product group a few weeks ago on writing a script to run to show you whether you've met all the prereqs, like have you got the Azure CLI installed and things like that. So what I've had a go doing for this demo today is actually taking that idea and applying it to the deployment script. So I did it on an earlier one, this one here, conversion, and now there's a batch file. And if I run the batch file, it's going to take me through to this. So it will, and I'm going to speak to Microsoft about getting this into the open source repo, because this is kind of cool. So it'll take you through, first of all, is the Azure CLI installed and can you log in? Have you selected the subscription? Because the last thing you want to do is try and deploy to a production subscription. Is the Azure the app configuration resource provider registered? This hit a lot of people who are, hit me as well. First time you run the tool, if you've got a new subscription, by default, a lot of the resource providers that ARM uses aren't enabled, aren't registered. And when you're using the portal, if you go to say create a logic app, the first thing the portal will do in the background is register the resource provider if it's not there before it goes to deploy an instance. But with app configuration, if it's not registered and you try and deploy it from a script, it fails because you're supposed to register it from the script first. So what this is going to do is check if it's registered, and it'll also check if you've got any free app configuration instances deployed. You can only have one per subscription, no matter what it's called. And with integration accounts, you can have one per region. So if you've already deployed app configuration and you run the deploy all script, it will fail early on, but then keeps running and you get all this red. So this will check to see, are you going to have an issue? And if you do have a free one registered, you've got two choices. You can either deregister it, or you can change the SKU that this deployment script is going to use by going into the ARM templates, or you can change the name by finding the name of the app config instance and using something like Notepad to do a find and replace. One of the things that we talked about with the product group that would be a nice feature would be if you could supply a file or parameters at the beginning saying I've got an existing app config and this is the one I want to use, and you supply the name, but that's not there yet. Right. The other thing to bear in mind is the first time you do a deployment, it's going to take at least 45 minutes. That's because API management takes over 25 minutes to provision. And when it gets to API management, it will look like the script is hung. It just sits there for 25 minutes until it's finished. But it's all right. If you did cancel, if you did just close the window, it would keep deploying in the background up on the cloud. And when you rerun the script, because all the ARM templates are using incremental mode, it means it will ignore anything that's already done and just keep going, which will make things a lot quicker. So if I press any key to continue, it's going to check if it's installed. It's going to bring up this window again to log in. OK. You can see it checked to see if the CLI was installed and tell me what version. It now gives me a list of the subscriptions I have access to. If I only have one, it will skip this and keep going. I've got two, and it gives me their names. It's a little bit nicer than the JSON, although it's not laid out nicely because I made the text too big for this demo. But I can push enter because I want to use the default one here. This is the subscription I want, so I'll push enter. Then it is going to check that the resource provider is registered. It is. It's noted that I do have a free SKU app configuration that's been deployed by the tool, and that the unique deployment ID used for that one is BTS. So it's basically saying that when I run this tool, when I ran it to generate these scripts, if I didn't use BTS, I'm going to have a problem. But I did use BTS. And then also that I haven't got any free SKU integration account instances. So would I like to continue? Well, yes, I would. And then off it goes. So now it's going to start doing all the deployment. And it says here what subscription it's deploying to and what ID. And then off it goes. And now it's going to run, those 312 deployment files, which will take a while. I'm going to kill it though, because I happen to have already done the deployment. I didn't want to wait 45 minutes because that's how long this session is. So I have deployed this already, and if I come up here to Azure, I will find under all my resource groups, one of these here is this one here. So aim.ftp pass-through was the name of the application, and that becomes aim-ftp pass-through. And in here, I'll find some API connections. I'll find a FTP receive adapter, an FTP send adapter, and a topic subscriber. Now, if we look in the receive adapter, most of these follow a similar pattern. I've got to say, these logic apps, I quite like the way they've been done. It's using the file connector trigger, the file system connector trigger. It's got some boilerplate variable stuff happening here. What's kind of cool about this is it's using a pattern called checkpoints, which means that instead of having, an action and then a decision and then inside there another action or a scope and then drilling down, sometimes you go into a logic app and you can't see anything until you start expanding. Here it's brought everything up to the top level, and a checkpoint is set and checked at each level. So, checkpoint should be null at this point, and it does its work and sets a checkpoint. And then here goes, well, is the checkpoint set to the value that this would have had it to? If not, then I'm skipping. If it is, I'll execute. And then we run all the way down till we get here and check, were we successful? And it makes it easy if you have to, say, do a resume. If I had to resume into here and skip over actions I've already done because they can only be executed once, it's a really nice pattern. But one of the cool things in here is that the file system connector does not support file masks like BizTalk does. I can say an FTP or file in BizTalk that I want to get, star.csv or employee star.csv. What happens here is that file mask gets converted to some regex. So it creates some regex and then executes that regex over the metadata it's got from the trigger, and then decides if it's actually going to get the file or skip. That's brilliant. So that's how that was implemented. So it's a way of implementing BizTalk features in code in logic apps. Alrighty, so we have deployed that logic app, and in fact, if we have a look around what's been deployed here, I can go back up to the resource groups here, and I can see there's a message bus resource group, and in there is, our API instance and, API management and app config and functions and our integration account. And in fact, in our integration account are the schemas and maps from the other samples I've uploaded. In fact, if you've got a BizTalk MSI with 300 schemas in there, this will generate the scripts to upload them for you, which is quite nice. And then, there's a system application one here where you've got there's other logic apps we looked at, like, JSON encoder and decoder, and they all follow a similar pattern. All right, so that's how we do a deployment. Moving back to the presentation, let's talk a little bit about orchestrations. So orchestration migration is a tricky thing. Orchestrations are complex. These are all the different things we have. Port types, correlation types, multi-part message types, send ports, receive ports. And then we've got the shapes, call orchestration, receive, send, message assignment, loop. Some of these make no sense in Azure. A scope with a transaction type of atomic, how would you do that in a logic app? So some of these won't really ever be supported. But if we look here, these ones that are shaded are the ones that are supported today, and the other ones are not. So variables are supported. All my variables will be brought across to a logic app. A decide shape will be message assignment, transform. The expressions are brought across, even though they don't run, and I'll show you those. So that's kind of cool. So there is limited support for orchestrations, and it's a good starting point. And in fact, I did a webinar. We did one of the BizTalk Migrator live, similar to Logic App Live sessions on Thursday, this last Thursday, with the product group, talking about this in greater detail. But if I look at a demo here, orchestration migration, if I show you a simple orchestration, this is one of the scenarios that comes with the tool. We have a single port type here, request response. We receive a message, we have a construct shape, we transform it, and then we send it. Couldn't get more simple. We've got two messages here, and in here we've got some schemas, purchase or request and response, and then we have the corresponding messages defined. Now I've already uploaded that to save time, and if I show you what that looks like, that is sitting somewhere here. Here it is here. So purchase order processor sitting right here. If I open that up, this is the logic app that was created from that orchestration. So it's subscribing to the message bus. This is equivalent of the receive shape. There's some boilerplate here, but the actual conversion stuff starts where we see these numbers. And the numbers are indicating that's an order in which things are done, because when they build a process manager here, an orchestration logic app, they're built out of snippets. It's quite funky. They're, the logic app is built by pulling together lots of different pieces and then, setting up the run afters and stuff. But the actual work for the orchestration's here. But here's the two messages that are being defined. They're XML messages, sure, but they're objects here. And then in here we've got a bit of boilerplate about decoding the service bus stuff, and then the construct shape is here, and then the transform. And here's the transform. We're executing a transform here. And then we've got a send coming down here, and the send does a few things that BizTalk does for you under the properties, so promoting properties for you under the hood. Sorry, BizTalk does this for you, and then we publish the message to Service Bus. So that's the orchestration. What about a slightly more complex orchestration? So I have one here, and I'll show it to you. It's got lots of variables. It's got some expression shapes with C# in them. And it's got a scope with an exception handler and some decision shapes in here as well. Now, I've already run the tool over, converting that. What if you just wanted to deploy only that orchestration and no more? Well, you can come down into here, find the application. So I would go to applications, I'd find the one for this. I'd go into intermediaries, and I'd find the folder for that orchestration. It's called complex org. And in here, I've got an API connection and a logic app. So I can just run the deployment of I can execute the PS1 files here that have got the numbers in them, and that will deploy just these. So if I come out to here, I've already got these set up. So let's deploy the API connection, and off it will go. Now, because I've already done an Azure CLI deployment, it knows the subscription I'm connecting to. But obviously, if I'd never done it, I'd want to make sure I'm deploying to the right subscription. So it's going to run ahead and do the API connection first. And these are generally quite quick. And then it's going to do the orchestration after that. or the logic app after that. Well, I'll have to manually tell it to do it. But you can do these manually. There we go, it's done now. You can deploy just parts of these. And bear in mind that these scripts, although it gives you everything, really the idea is that you put them into your own DevOps pipeline or GitHub Actions or something like that, you know, depending on how you do your deployments. Alrighty, so that's now deploying that, and we'll end up with something that looks very similar to this. Whilst I'm waiting for that, I will just say advanced concepts I'm going to look at quickly. How do you change the route? So if I wanted to, in a pipeline, insert the flat file decoder, how do I do that? And how do I change the configuration? And how do I refresh the cache? So we'll come back out to here, and hopefully, yep, it's deployed the orchestration. I'm calling it an orchestration, it's not really, it's a logic app. But if I find that it's here, and here we go, these are the two things that are deployed, and here's the logic app. And if we scoot through this really quickly, like I say, there's a lot to cover, and I'm aware of the time. In here, we've got similar things going on. We're, you know, subscribing to message bus, we're initializing, and then down here suddenly we've got all these variables we defined. So look, orc name, and that's got the same value that it had in the orchestration. Cool. And if we come further down and go into here, we'll find the scope here, the exception scope, and in there we've got an init shape. So if you remember in the orchestration, there was an init shape up here, initialized. It's an expression shape, and that's been, oops, sorry, wrong place. That's been converted to JavaScript shape, and in there, it's got all the code but commented out. So if you could run that code, uncomment it, but you'll have to do some work to do it. But anyway, there it is. There's the orchestration. The decide shape is down here. You know, it's all been done. In terms of config and routing slips, if we step back out of here and let's cancel out of that, I want to go to API management, sorry, app config, that's all right, don't mind doing that. So app config is where we store everything to configuration related. We go to Configuration Explorer, and we have an entry per what's called a scenario, and a scenario is, you know, receiving from a receive port and going to the message bus, message box, or message box to message box, like an orchestration, or message box to a send port. That's a scenario. In this case here, this is the FTP receive one, and there's always 3 entries: configuration entry, routing properties, routing slip. So we'd want to edit the routing slip. So we could come away to the end over here. It's not wanting to scroll. And this is a horrible editing experience because it's a text box with JSON in it. So I always bring it over here to Notepad++, and I will format it. And then let's say we wanted to add in a route. This route here is saying, well, when we've received the file, we want to promote various properties, specifically the message type, but also like the receive file name and stuff that's done for you by the adapter in BizTalk, and then publish it to the message box. But I now want to add in support for the flat file decoder. And I can do that by the resource idea here is the, it looks up the callback URL for the logic app on the fly, you know, the secure endpoint. So all you need to do is include the resource group name that logic app is in and the name of it. And I know that is called flat file message processor, and then flat file up here. Now, if I was to run this route again, it's now going to call the flat file message processor. It will fail because it needs config as well. I have to go back to the config editor and here and edit the configuration entry to specify what the name is of the flat file schema you're using. But that's how you do it. One thing to bear in mind is when you change these, they don't automatically update in API management. And the reason for that is API management caches things. And you can actually make a call. You can clear the cache by making a call to, say, configuration manager with a scenario name, and there's a parameter clear cache that you can set. But what I did is I cheekily set up another logic app with event grid, which will look for changes in app config and then make that call. And again, this is something I'm going to try and get into the source control because it's quite useful. It means you can change config and it's automatically refreshed. Alrighty, so what's next for the tool? Well, what I'd like to see, and this is up to the product group, support for the new dedicated runtime, function app running on function apps. Sandro did the previous session to this. Sandro was talking about that. It would be awesome to see support for that. Improved performance. Performance could be better. We're looking 20-25 seconds to pick up a file and send it out again, which is not as good as BizTalk, but then it scales better. If you do 1,000 files through this thing, it'll still take 25 seconds. If you did 1,000 files through BizTalk, I guarantee you it will take longer. More adapters, MQ, SAP, SQL, WCF. Better orchestration support. Business rules engine and BAM would be lovely to see. I don't know how we'll do it. How Microsoft would do it at least. Right, so last thing is please go to that survey. The product group would love you to. They want to know what else you would like to see. They've got to decide where they want to take this tool and how do they get community involvement. Ideally, we'd have people writing open source plugins for this and get people getting involved. But please, get involved with it. That's it. I feel like I rushed through that a little bit, but there was a lot to cover. If you have questions, please reach out to me, Probert Daniel on Twitter or Probert Daniel on LinkedIn, and I'll happily answer questions. And please enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the rest of Bootcamp. Thank you very much for coming today to my session. Thank you. Goodbye.